My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you the very best practices, best hearts, and great ideas from other disaster-affected communities. Thank you for joining us. Welcome once again to the podcast, How to Disaster, where we help you recover, rebuild, and reimagine. Today's guest is Jim White. Jim White is the Executive Director of the Oregon Nonprofit Association. Jim is actually based in Oregon, as you can tell from his title, but he has a global background, which is one of the reasons I wanted him on the podcast today. I've really enjoyed working with Jim since 2020, when Oregon experienced their worst wildfire season on record. It was at that time that I also came into contact with sort of a different way of doing things, that in Oregon, it's actually a little bit easier because they have a flattened hierarchy for how to actually speak to people, from all the way from the fire survivor to the governor's office. Jim White is a big part of that equation. He advises nonprofits on where the best place is to actually park your money to do the greatest good. But also he has, again, this global understanding because he has many decades of previous experience working for Mercy, which is a global relief nonprofit. He's a whiz at understanding the intersection of government, philanthropy, fire survivors, and public safety. So I've asked Jim on today to talk to us not only about his experience since the 2020 wildfire season in Oregon, but also to talk to us about what he brings for a larger lens of how to actually deal with disaster. Because what a lot of people don't know is how we deal with it globally and outside of the United States is not the same as we do inside of the United States. It's not that common to find somebody who has this much experience in both arenas. So once again, please join me in welcoming Jim White to the podcast. Jim White, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today. Welcome.
It's great to be here, Jennifer. Thanks for having me.
So I would love it if we could start off today, if you would tell our listeners a little bit about your current position with the state of Oregon, in the state of Oregon.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Jim White. I'm the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. We are the membership association support organization that supports the charitable benefit nonprofit sector in our state. There's a number of us across the whole country. Very proud to be connected with those folks, and along, certainly in the West Coast here, we have very deep relationships with our friends at Cal nonprofits down in California, with Washington nonprofits up in Washington and Idaho and Montana, and that's what we do.
So before we get into the 2020 wildfire season and how that really changed sort of your workflow and your work plan, can you talk to our listeners a little bit about your background? Is fascinating, especially with Mercy.
Right. So I've been with the Nonprofit Association of Oregon for almost 10 years now, and I love nonprofits. I love what we do in community and for community, because we're led by community, right? I grew into this work from being predominantly in the international relief and development space. I worked for most of my career, actually, in international relief and development in a number of different organizations. The last organization I worked for in that regard was Mercy Corps, which happens to be based here in Oregon, but works in over 40 countries around the world. And a lot of that work has to do with responding and helping people at a moment when they're dealing with some of the worst days of their lives, right? Is the time when people are experiencing, disasters, natural or man-made. And so I spent a number of years overseas working in particular parts of the world. And then I eventually was asked and came back to the Mercy Corps headquarters, which happens to be in Portland, Oregon. So that's how I actually wound up in Oregon.
take us, so somebody's listening to this who has not undergone a disaster, but they're just curious, like, how does one actually get into a job where you can do global relief? I think with the issue in with the war in Ukraine right now, a lot of people are looking at it and saying, how do people even get those jobs at all? So would you mind doing a little bit of personal background before we keep moving on?
Sure. No, fine. Yeah. I was actually, when I first got into international relief work, I was working, I was getting my graduate degree at Indiana University at the time. And like all poor graduate students, I needed some work over the summer. So I have an engineering background. And so I signed up to do water sanitation and housing engineering support for an organization responding to the people who had been displaced as refugees from the war in Chechnya. So this was in 1995. And so I worked directly in a war zone where the Russians were bombing and sieging and destroying civilian populations, right, left, and center. It's very terrible what's happening in Ukraine, very uncalled for. And so that was sort of where I kind of got my first sense of, oh, there's this other whole interesting possible world out there. So I actually didn't go back to graduate school that year. I stayed and worked the rest of that whole year in Chechnya and the neighboring republics right nearby. And of course, that war got worse and worse, and then it stopped for a little while, and then Putin restarted it later. And it's personally very rewarding, as you can imagine, to help people, but it is also incredibly taxing on you emotionally and physically. And oftentimes, it's a type of work where you have to make sure you prioritize your own mental health and breaks, because people can get really, really jaded and or just really emotionally destroyed by seeing how humans can treat other humans. In that case, as I said, unfortunately, my entry into this space was in a war zone. Mm-hmm. But I've been in a number of natural disaster responses where it's nobody's fault, let's say. There are usually big missing pieces in the space of how government has allowed buildings to be permitted that can either raise the level of the disaster by how much falls down or gets washed away, versus those countries where they've been able to keep really good standards of building, or that they've practiced their responses to disasters, and they've been able to ready the people for there being a disaster. So in a lot of the places that I work, these were unfortunately more in the developing world. And so these were places where people had, did not have as much of that background support at the governmental level or through, other international bodies to keep the disaster response capabilities robust. So in some of the places I worked, I specifically worked with these ministries of emergency situations or ministries of, departments of governments for how they could build their capacity internally. A big part of what I think any nonprofit should be doing is replacing ourselves with those people on the ground who live in that community, who can be there for their community. They know their community best, and they can help the people most directly. And so I've worked in, as I said, a number of places around the world where we've worked specifically and directly with ministries of emergency situations or those organizations that are responsible. What's fascinating, I think, with the governmental response as compared with the non-governmental or nonprofit response, as we call it in the United States, is oftentimes the the nonprofits are closer to the community than the government is,
Mhm.
and they have less barriers, frankly, less restrictions on how they can immediately show their care. I mean, that's what's so amazing, I think, about the nonprofit sector is that we are private corporations, but we do public good, right? So there's a lot of organizations who've built real capacities, and I'm very happy to see the growth of After the Fire and what you've been doing in helping people, particularly in the West, understand these climate-driven fires that are driving so many people into displacement on a scale that was the kind of stuff that I used to see in developing countries around the world.
So I think there's one really interesting thing that, well, you brought up many interesting things, but one of them is like the what happens with ad hoc housing, and we see that often in, I know that it happens in other countries and certainly in our territory of Puerto Rico for sure, but we're seeing that in rural communities. We're seeing ad hoc housing that had never been permitted because maybe somebody's great grandfather had built it, or maybe it was just built because in the rural areas are housing so many of our vulnerable populations that have been pushed out of suburban and urban areas, but also may just have a lot of them just have generational ties to the land. And so for them, if they can live at 25,000 a year if they don't have a mortgage, and if they don't have a mortgage, they often don't have any insurance. And so we're seeing this great disparity in the ability to overcome and build back after a disaster. Can you speak to some of the things that you have seen just from your work in the United States, though, that remind you of some of the challenges globally?
Yeah, I'm actually going to start with the international piece and come back to the US. So what's interesting I've noticed is that because we have states' rights in the United States, right, there's no specific joined agreement across municipalities or counties or certainly states on what level of humanitarian response the government would then hold themselves accountable to. So all states have some form of an Office of Emergency Management, and most counties and most states have something similar, a mirrored, kind of more local response.
Mm-hmm.
Not every town and city can have those, but certainly major cities have similar response bodies. What's interesting to me is that the way in which you determine your standard of care is incredibly important. And so internationally, it's true that basically anybody in a country, let's take the Ukraine, in a country where, the rules have basically been suspended because of a man-made disaster, in this case, a war, the level of care in the immediate term is whatever you can get to those people to help relieve some of the stress and strain of what they're dealing with. So food, basic food, water, non-food items, some type of a shelter. But once they become refugees, which has an international definition, or when people are displaced, but displaced with certain criteria, certain definitions around it, what are called IDPs, internally displaced peoples. Mm. They're protected under international covenants governed by the United Nations, in some cases supported by other international treaties and laws. And it's always interesting to me that given the fact that we don't have any agreed standard of care in the US, but we do for international NGOs responding internationally because we come under and we support the responses of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or another, the World Health Organization, or one of these international bodies of which the United States in this case is a signature to. So when you talk about these sort of you didn't use the word makeshift. What was the exact term?
I used the word ad hoc because I learned that out of Puerto Rico, that's how like 52% of the homes or something that were destroyed were ad hoc. And so FEMA had to figure out how do you unblue tarp them. They were called blue tarps because that's how they do an immediate fix. So ad hoc.
So there's the pre-disaster permitting or lack of permitting that causes potentially even more people to suffer because the level of engineering standard, the code literally is just not high enough for the danger that's in that area. And on the other side, you have the post-disaster response, the agreed level of care that you're asking the international actors who would be coming in to support these people to adhere to. So I just wanted to mention in the international space, if you're an international NGO and you're working in Poland or Hungary or on the border right now, it would be expected that you would adhere to what are called sphere standards, that if you're taking the responsibility for these refugees in a particular camp, you're going to meet certain standards of care. You can't say, well, all we do is food, so you don't give them any water or sanitation, right? So this is why it forces international NGOs in some ways to work together. There are specialist organizations who may only do water and sanitation because they have water and sanitation expert engineers and such. There may be another group who only does medical care and triage care or psychosocial care. I mean, imagine what's going on after a disaster, whether it's man-made or natural, the incredible mental health issues that come out, or physical ailment, if you're not in a place where healthcare can be immediately rendered to people, or it has to be rendered long-term in a chronic situation like a displacement. Wildfires are a displacing and incredibly displacing force in America, but we don't treat them the way and with the same level of care that as an international NGO would be expected as you're responding to a crisis in Ethiopia or in, the Congo or in Indonesia. So to me, it's very interesting that while the US in general, and I think America, first off, I would say is extremely generous. Americans are extremely generous. I'm so proud of the nonprofit philanthropic sector and the way that people in America give to their communities through groups like nonprofits. The standard governmentally that we require locally is ad hoc. So your term ad hoc to me really rang true. You could literally have a totally different standard of care in two towns that were affected by the same fire because they may be across county borders. Mm-hmm. But could be sort of twin towns, if you will, right down the road from each other, but a totally different level of care is being given. And that's a real problem in America. And I think we really need to figure out in the long term, what standards of care do we expect in something like, the disasters that are these climate-driven wildfires in the West in particular, that displace people for 3, 4, 5 years. We're not talking about temporary displacement and then they get to go back. We're talking these people will not be probably in their homes for, kids are going to miss their entire high school. They will be displaced in a totally different high school for their entire high school, experience. And so there's standards then, and I think we need to start adhering to. And if the government is not going to create them, I would encourage the nonprofit sector to create them directly and start adhering to them ourselves. And I would again offer that sphere standard was actually created by nonprofits. It was created by international NGOs. It wasn't created, it was supported by the United Nations, but it was created by these other organizations. And so I do worry about the ad hocness of the responses.
Same.
Yeah.
I do too. And I think that, I try to be super generous in the sense that I understand that the era of megafires is new. and that we are on a learning curve. And, we kind of knew in 2015 when we saw the Valley Fire in Lake County, just north of us, like we were like, that looks horrible. But even that was really not much. It was a blip compared to what happened then here in the North Bay in 2017. Then we thought we were going to be the Kardashians of wildfire. And then quickly within 13 months, that was completely untrue. And in between there, we had the Thomas Fire and some other major disasters in Ventura County and Montecito. And then, it was very startling. That entire 13-month period was incredibly instructive. But it was really, and we figured we were there, but then when the 2020 wildfire season came, it really confirmed it, because in our case in Sonoma Valley, that also brought we had 11 fires in 2017 all at once, right? And then we had the Glass Fire in 2020, which would come after. It was the third mega fire post 2017 in our county alone. And it was like, well, okay, I guess we're sort of here and it's real. And one of the things that I really noted was that the coordination with all of the first responders, that was tight. Like they upped their game seriously in our state for sure. Between 2017 and 20, every year it got better and better and better and better. So we didn't even have federally declared disasters for a lot of it. State for sure, but we were like, oh, only 600 homes. That felt like a win to us, which is sad, but true, because it's a 10th of what we lost just in Sonoma County in 2017. So I kind of felt like, and I still feel this way, which is that we in the nonprofit sector are sort of lagging behind the first responder sector who've got their coordination down, what you were just talking about. The thing is like, how does and I would be interested from an after the fire point of view for sure, but like getting everyone to play in the pool, like in synchronized swimming, is a bit of an interesting undertaking for us. It has been anyway, because I think with the VOAD, or there are certain groups that have been doing this, volunteer organizations after disaster that are funded by FEMA. They don't really say anything to FEMA if they don't like how it's going, because they're also dependent on FEMA to pay their bills. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I'm not saying that FEMA is so delicate that they can't take it. Of course they can take it. They can take it all day, but you're just less likely to do it, which is why it sort of kept us out of the VOAD. So I think the VOAD is their attempt at that coordination, but that's very different from long-term recovery. Can you talk about what you've witnessed? Because, and also, was this your first big wildfire that you had seen in 2020? So take us through your fire story, I guess, is where we're going to start with that, and then get into the organization.
Well, so we had here in Oregon some fires that they didn't burn very many structures. So oftentimes those don't get classified as mega fires until you start burning people out of homes, but they burned thousands of acres, right? Square miles and miles of acreage, going back, before certainly, white culture was here in North America. There were fires, right? So there's long traditions of indigenous populations,
There are, but they did it so often that getting these hot, fast 500-foot walls of flame just really wasn't what was happening when the land was actually managed.
That's what's interesting, is that we're dealing now with climate-driven different types of fires happening. And I'm not a fire scientist, so I'm maybe going to try to claim the differences and what all the different pieces mean. But certainly here in Oregon, the Labor Day fires, as they're called, the Labor Day fires of 2020, had this unfortunate situation where not only we had a super dry, super hot summer, but there was also very heavy shear winds that happened over that Labor Day weekend, that once fires started, or in some cases, the winds actually knocked down electrical lines that generated a few of the fires, and that's still under contention as to how some of these were even started. And then the wall of fire just ran down some of these terrain features. They tend to run along canyons, right? They tend to run
watersheds,
tops of trees, and run along watersheds and such. And those are often the places where people habitate, right? That's where your fly fishing, people are, and people who've, maybe been there because they were part of the lumber industry for years, and these small hamlets in some of these areas. We had one particularly interesting, or not interesting, but unfortunate fire that actually ran right down the main streets of some of the towns in Southern Oregon in Talent and
Phoenix.
Phoenix and Talent. Yeah.
Jim, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I just have to do a quick commercial break, and we will be right back. Once again, I'm sitting with Jim White.
Fannie Mae provides mortgage options for you and your family. If you have a mortgage owned by Fannie Mae, you may have financial options available after a disaster, such as forbearance plans, deferral of payments, lending assistance, and counseling. Find out more from our Disaster Response Network. Go online at www.knowyouroptions.com/relief or call 1-877-833-1746 today.
And we are back. Thank you for staying with us. We have Jim White on the podcast. He's the executive director of the Association of Nonprofits for the state of Oregon. Jim, you were just talking about what happened in Southern Oregon in the towns of Talent and Phoenix. Go ahead.
Yeah, in the towns of Talent and Phoenix, we had the fire go right down the main street 99, which interesting is sort of I-5 before I-5 existed. It was the main northwest corridor up and down between Washington and California, obviously right through the state of Oregon. So, in that case, we had an urban fire racing right down the street. And in most of the other cases in the Labor Day fires, they were following up along terrain features or going along riverbeds and these things, canyons, the Santium Canyon fire. So in those fires, that was certainly my first experience. To answer your question directly, Jennifer, it was my first experience of a mass event of a fire in Oregon where so many people were now displaced, where the authorities, had to now do something in a very significantly different way than they'd ever had to do before.
And talk about the housing feature is really interesting too, because we were, and this is a little bit of a side note, but one of the things like in the Southern Oregon fire is actually very different from the Santium Canyon fire, for example, because it was so urban. They lost 18 mobile home parks, very vulnerable community. And it took out their downtowns as well, which was very startling. It actually moved up the Greenway, and they think it was arson. I haven't heard anything more about that. But it really sort of was started in a, unfortunately in a wealthier area, and then just displaced a ton of workforce housing. And it's a very startling thing to come back from. But it was also, I have witnessed FEMA try to take that as a little bit of an opportunity to do some innovation with like the Totem mobile home park, which they've agreed to actually leave the infrastructure in the ground instead of taking it out. And that is post-disaster housing for people. But it's not as simple when you get into a super rural area like the Santiam Canyon. Can you talk about just what you've learned a little bit since over the past nearly 2 years of watching this unfold?
Yeah, I mean, the rules, the bureaucracy, the level of bureaucracy is just out the roof. It might be useful here. You may have done this on this podcast before, but to just kind of refresh people on how a disaster gets declared. So the feds can't come into a state without the governor inviting them. Right. And so a disaster declaration is requested of the president. And they have different levels of disaster declaration, but a presidential disaster declaration is usually the highest level, and it comes with both the first response capacity, so they can borrow over, hotshot teams from, there's people who fight these fires in California and Oregon and Washington who are from Montana or Nevada or vice versa. I know your folks came up here and were helping to fight our fires. Our firefighters, our wildland firefighters go down and help fight fires in California. So there's that paying for all of that service doesn't come out of either county or fire district funds when they send their team of 20 firefighters down to California from Oregon. It takes a long time for that money to go through the system. I know that. I've heard that from some of the fire captains. But at least like you said earlier, there's a tighter, more coordinated structure there that seems to work. And I've posited before that I think the reason is that fire companies and that whole apparatus are built much more on a militarized system, right? You've got captains and you've got, structures. Nonprofits are not that. They're not that. They're people from the community responding locally. And so in the case of how the nonprofits then begin to respond in these, it's much more ad hoc. It's much more come as you are. And that's where I think some standard setting would be useful. But when the disaster declarations get declared in these areas, you have to meet certain thresholds. The state has to fill in certain paperwork of doing an assessment. They feed that up to FEMA, and then FEMA can begin to do what FEMA does. But a lot of what FEMA has done, in my opinion, for wildfires is based out of an experience of Southeast hurricanes and Midwest tornadoes. It's not wildfire specific. And so there's a different way, and maybe Jennifer, you want to talk about some of the work of After the Fire in trying to help in that thinking. But I think we've got both downstream, how to better coordinate at the ground level, because local community organizations don't use a militarized system at all to think about how they work with community. And on the upstream level, around the policy, around how do you change the way that we respond to wildfires differently than how we might respond to floods or hurricanes or tornadoes.
Well, and it actually goes back and speaks to the displacement issue, which is something that is not as much of an issue. We're not saying it isn't a massive issue, but you have to have something like the level of Sandy or Katrina in order for it to have that degree of displacement. FEMA is traditionally, all the agencies are traditionally set up for wind and rain events. And we're not upset with them for not instantly knowing what to do for wildfires. We always say to them, hey, you know what? We are your partners in learning our way through this, which is why we do advocacy, which is why we connect with lawmakers, because, and heads of the agencies, and they're always very grateful for us coming in with not just one county or city's perspective, not just one fire perspective, but instead a more global perspective, and to say, here's what we see on repeat. And one of the first things we are looking at right now on our federal platform is how do we change the way that wildfire declarations are made? Right. To pre-position, because as soon as the fire weather comes out, all those fire departments start to pre-position themselves, but none of that is followed by how the nonprofit sector or the care and feeding of the community is not pre-positioned. And the threshold for wildfires to be declared is wrong in our mind. It's ineffective. Like the Dixie Fire in California last summer was 750,000 acres 2 months in before it was declared a federal disaster. And that's, so air quality has to become like one of the triggers for it. And we're really pleased because Senator Padilla actually has the Fire Act, which was in the omnibus the other day. So I just haven't any time to check on it, but we know that he's taken that up. As we accomplish one thing, we're looking towards the next thing. And one of the things that we see is the type of housing that's provided. If it's provided, it's often not provided. Like in the Caldor fire in El Dorado County that saved Lake Tahoe, those people are not eligible for individual assistance or a housing mission because of the wealth of everybody else in the county.
Right.
Most of those are second homes, which we see a lot in rural areas. And so in your, what else has surprised you in serving wildfire, or what lessons have you taken from your previous experience that you think should be implemented?
Well, I do think what I can say specifically, and again, I should remind that my organization, Nonprofit Association of Oregon, does not do direct service delivery. We support the nonprofits who then support to do that work directly. So we're trying to help them with how can they manage their organization effectively and efficiently to be able to do their service as well as they can. It was certainly the case that we learned quickly that the understanding that the FEMA folks had around how these long-term recovery groups would be formulated in the community was borrowed from their experiences because they have the experience they have, right? Was borrowed from their experiences of working in other states, mostly in those hurricane and tornado alley type situations. But there was both the specificity of not only how long-term recovery for a wildfire should look, but also just even understanding that you can't transfer fiscal sponsorship agreements from one state to a different one, because states have different laws and rules. And after we did some education with the FEMA folks a couple of times, we committed to our organization paid for the incorporation of all the LTRGs in Oregon, because we just wanted them to make sure they did it right. And we hired an attorney to work with each one of them individually to get them set up properly so that they wouldn't run into problems later on when FEMA tried to give them assistance, or somebody else tried to, a funding organization, a private charitable organization tried to give them support. They wouldn't get caught in, you were never properly registered. But some of the documentation and the counsel they were getting was actually incorrect. And that's not helpful, right? To have. The other thing we learned certainly was the power that the community has to give, to self-heal, to support themselves. I was blown away by how quickly some of these organizations that didn't exist before, or organizations that didn't really have a responsibility to do a particular thing, stretched beyond their work and agreed to do things that they didn't really have to. I want to give the example of like the Santium Hospital, which is in, or
side note, sorry, so glad you brought that up, because that's exactly where I was going to steer you. I am just blown away by them. Go. Love it. Highlight.
So the Santium Hospital is a regional hospital, rural hospital in a town right at the mouth of the Santiam Canyon, just a little bit, maybe 15 miles east of Salem, our capital of Oregon. And they had for years they created and were running what was called a service integration team, a SIT, because the people in the Santiam Canyon, which stretches for miles and miles and miles, sort of east to west across the Cascade Range. So this is the main river drainage system, so terrain feature that then leads to a pass that would take you over to Bend, basically to the cities of Sisters and Bend on the other side of the Cascade Range. The Santiam Canyon is, historically an area that has a large number of small towns, some of them incorporated, some of them not, that are logging and milling towns, right? And so this area has its own particular needs that might be different than some of the flat plain areas of the Willamette Valley, the mid sort of section of the main I-5 corridor that comes, north to south through Oregon. And so the Santiam Hospital had created this service integration team, not only to help people with their health care, but they expanded into what I would call beyond health services to human services, right? So they were doing, prenatal care for women, checking in their clinics in these towns, or they were doing addiction counseling and services around mental health. And so they were going beyond, let's say, the traditional, maybe you bring your injured self to our hospital and we treat you here, to work up and down this, and with community, folks who are from these communities and know the populations well. So when the wildfire happened, a group of some of these advisors to, board members of, and the CEO of the Santium Hospital all gathered together, and they agreed to set up the Santium Canyon Wildfire Relief Fund, which would be fiscally sponsored by the hospital and work together with the SIT, it's called, to help support these people of their area. I should also mention that the Santiam Canyon stretches across 2 counties, which again comes into these jurisdictional issues. The difference in the response in those 2 is palpable. You can really see it. The SIT and the Santiam Canyon Wildfire Relief Fund blend out that palpable difference, if you will. They don't have that same difference of care, if you will, across the counties. And so it was pretty impressive how quickly they not only could raise money, but started right away helping people and putting money out the door long before anybody from FEMA or the Oregon Emergency Management, or before there were disaster case managers. I've jokingly commented here in Oregon that, like, you know, some of, not only, I want to say, it wasn't only the Santiam Canyon group, but several others were doing this in Glide, in Otis, some of the other fire areas, and certainly down in Jackson County. They were DCMing, so disaster case managing, 12 months before anybody from FEMA or any of the contracted people actually put a official DCM on the ground. They had been disaster case managing for a year before we physically got the disaster case management system set up in Oregon. And that's where those entities can I would encourage government to use the apparatus that's already in place. Don't superimpose your own apparatus on top of them. And that's unfortunately what happened here.
Well, and I think that that's actually a lesson for nonprofits too, that are like, we are based in Sonoma, California, and we've been working in Oregon since October of 2020. But it was really important to us that our style is very much like, how do we support, not how do we supplant? We're not interested in that. We totally believe that local people have the relationships. They're going to put their kids, you know, on those soccer fields in 10 years. Our job is not so different from your job, which is how do we actually support the people who are already on the ground doing great work in order to coach them, provide virtual services, provide like essentially a free consulting service that's free to everyone. But what we see though, which I think gets in the way of nonprofits actually setting a standard of integrative care, which is like what the SIT team does, SIT people do on a smaller level, is that because wildfire is relatively recent, we have people in this field who just want to like blaze in on a cloud of glory and take over. And then just say like, oh, well, you don't know what to do. I'm just going to tell you what to do. And I'm going to get on all of your LTRGs and all your calls. And because now it's all zoomed out, I can just suck up all the air out of the room. That may be harsh, but that's what we witness all the time. And rural communities are particularly vulnerable to that because of the lack of capacity. It's not a lack of talent at all. So I'm just back.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think the other thing that complicates things is that the FEMA folks and the states have a preset modality that they'd agreed to, and they sort of mirror each other at the federal and state levels around how do they deal with these nonprofits from the emergency side. To be clear, this is the emergency side, and I want to try to be careful and clear about this. So in response to these disasters, whether it's a wildfire or not, but certainly with the wildfires, the FEMA has a inbuilt relationship with the national VOAD, and the national VOADs have inbuilt relationships with the state VOADs. So they are then made up of largely voluntary organizations. That hence the name, Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. In our situation in the wildfires, we had two really compellingly different elements at play that did not allow that system to work well at all, in my opinion. And one was COVID.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't fly in a group of Baptists from Indiana to rebuild a house in a town in Glide because of the COVID restrictions. You just couldn't. So the volunteerism part of bringing all these assets in from outside to support these communities didn't exist, really. It was seriously hampered. The second piece is that, as the name says, these are largely voluntary, although not all of them are voluntary organizations, but largely voluntary organizations. And it doesn't really take into account the staffed nonprofits who are already there on the ground doing work that can be probably more quickly realigned to give that service to the community. And so again, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, and I don't think Maggie or any of her team would disagree with me. Dina or Ed or anybody who's involved with the Santiam Canyon Wildfire Relief Fund would disagree. They had no idea who VOAD was.
Yeah.
They just started doing what they knew would need to be done. And then that understanding had to come much later, but the federal and state people only know those VOAD structures. And so they were blind in a way to what's already there on the ground happening. And that is a learning I definitely have seen our OEM start to recognize and realize is like, oh, there's a whole bunch of other nonprofits who already do certain things with our other line departments of state, whether it's our Oregon Health Authority or our Oregon Department of Human Services. They're already in relationship, oftentimes through contracts and grants, to deliver certain services. So there was a real miss there in, we're talking to a group over here who's trying to get volunteers brought in when other organizations who are directly involved with the counties or states in delivering other kinds of services aren't even being talked to.
Well, and also if you're not being talked to, you're not being funded though, too. So if you look at it like, well, two things. First, I'm hoping that as we grow our skill set and grow our presence, and is that we're able to be like a translator between in that space, in that gap space. Because, we've certainly had other national nonprofits come to us and say, well, why won't anybody return our calls in this fire? And we'll be like, who are you working with? And they're working with the one person that nobody will work with. And it's just like, because they're not actually boots on the ground, and it's very hard to figure out, who's who. We all make mistakes going into it. Don't get me wrong. I certainly have, but the other side of it is that, when I see an amazing group of people like the SIT, and I see how they've expanded now to 21 people for the long-term recovery, and what I want to do is like make a big banner over my head and fly into the state and feds and say, this should be funded for 3 years fully at a fixed number of FTEs. Right. And the people running this program who are already dealing with a hugely traumatized community, doing great work though in the midst of it, truly like inspiring work. Why are they also stressed about funding for the FTEs, the full-time positions that they need in order to get to the other side of this and hopefully come out even better? Like that's what you hope for. Right. If they're not being spoken to, then they're not being funded. And so that's another one of our concerns, and one of the things that we are hoping to set a different tone. And that's why we have social pinpoint, or we have certain things that we're hoping that they'll look and they'll see who's already on the ground. And then we want to highlight those systems and organizations as best practices. And we think the SIT is definitely a best practice. There's no question. I would agree.
I would agree. And I think that there's been other real innovations made across, the various burn zones that we've experienced here. I did just want to say one other thing, and it goes back a little bit to the disaster declarations. For a person who's lost their home, it doesn't matter whether you feel like, whether the state recognizes that, well, there were enough, the threshold was met at a certain level for us to do a certain level of response, or that it trips over that now we can receive federal money for our response. What I think is incredibly inequitable is when, as we had here in Oregon, a case where we had these massive Labor Day fires in 2020, and then we had the bootleg fire in 2021. And that burned 600 square miles of largely uninhabited national or state forest lands, marshlands, plains areas. But there were habitations scattered throughout some of that area. Some of them were generationally, they'd gotten, sort of grandfathered in to be able to have a homestead in these areas that went back, decades and decades. And so unlike the situation that we had with the Alameda fire, which burned down 99W and, through the towns of Talent and Phoenix. And as you mentioned, horrendous displacement, especially to the Latinx population there. In the bootleg fire, you didn't have people living in these trailer parks. You literally had maybe a trailer, and the next person living nearby was 10 miles away, 15 miles away. So these people were much more rural, almost frontier, scattered across that 600 square miles. They did not meet that presidential disaster declaration or the federal disaster declaration, and therefore they're not getting the same level of support. But for that individual, for that family, it's the same pain. They lost everything.
Well, we would like to see it, we would like to talk about it being applied for square miles, for a level of, we can obviously measure pollution in the air. We do it all the time. It's not like we're only asking for like the same kind of, utilizing technology that already exists to just change the metrics of what that would look like. And we're not, we're not trying to negate the role of the state or the local or anything like that. But there is like a point where if you don't get any help at all from the feds, then what is the burden from the state all the way down to that homesteader on, in a frontier situation? And I totally appreciate that. And because it's going to become more and more common, we don't see that not happening again. We see that we predict that will happen over and over and over again. So we're kind of like okay, everybody, let's figure this out as quickly as we can and do the best job that we can. So because we're running out of time, I wanted to do two things with you. I've told everybody since I've met you, I said, I think Jim White is the smartest person I've ever met in the business of nonprofits.
Thank you.
True.
Thank you.
And earned too. And so, I could talk to you all day, which won't work for a podcast, but will work for you and me. Okay. So my first question is, what is your advice for funders when the funders are looking around in the middle of a disaster and their heart goes out to them? And what's your advice for them on where and how to put their money? And also, can you talk about the role of long-term funding?
Yeah. So I'm going to start first with very quickly, governmental funders. You need to get your act together interdepartmentally. Mm-hmm. You need to pick who's going to be in charge, and then they need to have that authority and be given the resources, and that it's coordinated across the different line departments. Sometimes governments, go jurisdictionally. We all always see those things where that's not your jurisdiction, kind of thing in the TV shows. But for the government side, they've got to get clear on jurisdictional authorities and allowing that leadership to happen. Then for the private philanthropy, I think it's imperative that particularly foundations, whether they exist as a community foundation or whether they exist as a private foundation, that they have a plan for all of the programming that they do. They should be building in the resilience by asking those grantees, how would you continue to support this if something bad happens? So build it into everything they do in terms of a budget line in a grant, and a portion of this must be of the money we're giving must be built into how this program that we're funding is going to be remaining resilient even in a disaster. And from a coordination standpoint, they need to do a much better job of coming together and deciding how they can either pool their funds, or in the cases where they can't pool their funds, where they can very closely collaborate so that they're not, competing. They're not putting these local organizations and local communities in the space of having to compete to receive these funds, and the same organization may win across 3 different funders while one other organization completely loses out.
Often because they have that person who can write the grant, may have the relationship, and also if there's any match funding, they also have that. So it automatically, like disaster, favors those who have over those who have not.
Right,
so.
right.
Yeah.
And then with private individuals who might be funding, try to get to know the organizations that you're giving to. I know that in a disaster, they may be popping up and you've never heard of them before. You can check out with your state association, or check out with through Charity Navigator or GuideStar. Is this a reputable organization? And allow for the fact that some of these may be brand new, but again, that's where you might want to check in with your state association and see, do you know about these people? Do you know what's going on? There were some fantastic organizations that came into being because of these wildfires, and they're doing a great job, but they didn't exist before, so they wouldn't have a Charity Navigator or a GuideStar rating yet. So I would just encourage people to really think about how they want their donated funds to be used, and remember, it's not just the blankets and the food at the beginning of the disaster. These disasters last for years and years and years.
They do. And I think that one of the things that, we've worked with a lot of community foundations, and I'm always sort of curious how they're going to approach it. And some of them are so creative and amazing. And I think that what we're always looking for is not just one standard of how they are dispersing the funds that they gather, but are they serving the community in front of them in the way that they need it? Like in Mendocino County, they specifically were incredibly creative with not very much money and helped a lot of people get home. Like, it was so impressive to work with them. In Napa County, they were able to give $35,000 to every person who lost a home, as long as they weren't over 300% of AMI, which in Napa County is not low, by the way. Right. But they had the funds, and the goal was to outspend it. We've conversely also seen a community foundation hold on to the funds forever and say, like, we're going to disperse a little bit, but actually none of these are ever going to go to, this is not going to a fire survivor, period. We're going to work on other things with those funds. We're going to build resiliency into our community, but we will not disperse them to a fire survivor, any of it. And so we have seen like this huge variety. And so I think it's okay, especially if you are a big donor, to say specifically to whoever you're giving it to, here's where I would like this to go. But please, we're begging you to please stop refusing to fund capacity.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Nobody is asking like a baseball team or Coca-Cola to, really pare down on their staff in order to bring down the cost of, what I mean? I guess maybe we are sometimes, but there is this idea in the nonprofit sector that we should underfund everybody who works in it, while we're also challenging them with solving the most difficult problems in society. And so.
Right, exactly. I mean, we're big cheerleaders for there's a movement called the overhead myth, that overhead or administration of a nonprofit is bad. These are people who do this as a profession. You want them to do it professionally. You want that level of care, that certification. I mean, those women who work at the service integration team, I mean, they're fantastic. And
they're so good.
They've got, accreditations that they're required to have as hospital workers, and then also with the state. Of course you got to pay them. right? And pay
Well,
them
you got
well.
it. And I think it actually comes out of sort of this history of that, women would be married and then they're, upper middle class women. And then on the side, they were, because they couldn't enter into a lot of other professions, but they could do charitable work. And so the idea that we don't pay them, I think, is an antiquated view with a misogynistic overtone. That's how I feel about it. It's kind of like the profession of education. It was pretty well paid until women started entering into that profession. And then it became like, oh, this will be a bonus to your husband's paycheck.
Right.
And so we would really like to see that that change. And also, you want really good minds on this. And a lot of people who work in a nonprofit that in this world have master's degrees, have PhDs. Like they they come to it highly qualified. They have other choices. Like you could have gone into the private sector easily and made a very, very, very healthy living.
Yeah, and I chose to do this instead.
And you chose to do this. And so my other question for you is, what's your advice for nonprofits, as they are facing a disaster? Maybe they need to stretch, maybe they need to figure out how to work with other people or apply for funding collaboratively, or what's your advice there?
You basically listed all of the things I was going to say. So absolutely, they've got to be thinking about the collaboration, how they can effectively and efficiently use the resources that become available, how they can work together. Not everybody has to create a new nonprofit to do something. I mean, that might seem odd coming from someone who does what I do, but this is not about the ego of one individual and their mission to help people. It's about how an organization can be structured to support these people who've been, in this case, hurt, damaged in some way by a wildfire. And so there's, I just take the hat off to those organizations where there was no one else actually there. They created something, and where there was already something there and discussions happen quickly that a fiscal sponsorship could be created. You don't have to create a whole brand new nonprofit. That's also a great mechanism. And then collaborating, these long-term recovery groups, these LTRGs, have a hugely important role in coordinating, collaborating. What I'm seeing is they're beginning to become more implementers as opposed to coordinators. And I caution them, stay in your lane, because your lane is vitally important, right? Mm-hmm. And it is, community mobilization, like democracy, I guess, is a little messy, right?
Yeah.
But it's the most pure feeling of the community about themselves, because ultimately these nonprofits are all governed by all volunteer boards who are made up of people from the community. So they're literally of the community, right? That they're supporting, even if they do have paid staff. So it's important that we all get better at collaborating, and we build, just like I'm suggesting on the foundation and philanthropic side, build mechanisms for coordination. We on the nonprofit side need to do better at that as well. And whether that's through the VOAD system, and we all just really embrace that and then lift it up and re-energize that, or whatever it is we need to do there. But we can't get caught flat-footed like this again.
No, and I think that one of the things that we're hoping is, we had a kind of a unique start, and we were not your normal nonprofit. And because we started with $2 million, PG&E gave it to us. I mean, no doubt it was a panic, like a little bit of guilt in there for sure, in December of 2017. And they won't mind me saying that because they would agree with that. But it allowed me space to actually chase the mission instead of chasing the funding. Because once you end up chasing the funding solely, then that's what all of your programs become, what people are willing to fund as opposed to what needs to be funded. And I'm so gratified to see people and funders lately really understand why that's so important to allow an organization like ours, that we should be setting the agenda because we have the most experience in that area and we can prove it. Because otherwise we would have become, a social, just nothing wrong with social equity. It just doesn't serve the entire community in disaster. And we don't need to implement social equity programs. It's not,
Right.
Not what we do. So is there anything that you wish I would have asked you that I didn't ask you today?
I actually, I can't think of anything. I think you really got me pretty good. So yeah,
I love that.
yeah.
Well, Jim White, I love working with you. I appreciate your counsel and your advice. And can you please tell the audience where they can find out more about you and your organization?
Sure. So we're the Nonprofit Association of Oregon, and it's www.nonprofitoregon.org. Check us out on the website, and we do a lot of virtual work right now, especially, but we do that even when we're not. But otherwise, we're working all across Oregon, working with local community-based nonprofits, helping them build themselves better.
And if someone from another state-based nonprofit, obviously they would know how to get a hold of you, because sharing best practices and best lessons is what we are all about.
Sure.
And we know that you share that value as well. And we're so happy. I'm so happy to have had you on today. And I really appreciate you being on the podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information, please visit our website at afterthefireusa.org. And if you liked this video, please hit subscribe.
Navigating the recovery process after a fire is challenging, particularly with the additional issues caused by COVID-19. Fannie Mae is here to help. If you live in a FEMA-declared disaster area, you can request free assistance from our Disaster Response Network. Fannie Mae, in partnership with Maury Management International's Project Porchlight, launched the Disaster Response Network in 2018. This program uses HUD-approved counselors to offer support. These counselors have been specially trained as disaster coaches. They address the challenges homeowners and renters face when recovering from a disaster. There's no charge for their services. The goal of the Disaster Response Network is to help people return to pre-disaster normal as quickly as possible. Clients are matched with a coach who work with them one-on-one throughout their recovery. In the initial conversation with clients, coaches review the status of the homeowner's recovery process, including current challenges, decisions that need to be made, and immediate long-term goals. They discuss topics like income and expenses, insurance, housing, credit or debt challenges, as well as aid or other assistance programs that may be available. This may include FEMA applications and Small Business Administration, or SBA, loans. The coach helps the client plan and prioritize the next steps for their recovery. Moving forward, the coach continues to be there for the client, reaching out to them regularly, at least monthly, but more often when needed, for up to 18 months' time. These regular check-ins provide the client the opportunity to ask questions, get help tackling challenges, and keep things moving as they work through their recovery. It's also where coaches can help identify new recovery assistance or grants that have become available, strategize new next steps for recovery, and talk through difficult decisions or priorities. One of the key ways coaches assist Disaster Response Network clients is by helping intervene when something has gone awry. Coaches will, with the clients on the line, call insurance companies to adjust their claims when costs exceed initial estimates, or call the client's creditors to request payment relief. The Disaster Response Network's approach ensures survivors have a personal financial expert working with them throughout their recovery. By helping minimize the financial impact of a disaster, survivors can recover more quickly. To get confidential disaster relief assistance, call the Disaster Response Network at 877-833-1746. Once again, that is 877-833-1746. Or visit knowyouroptions.com/relief for more information.